Oh, there we go. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our 145 media availability. I'd like to introduce Eric Davidson, HU President, who will introduce our speaker.
Okay, thank you. Do I have to hold this down? Thank you. Well, that's a very easy task in this case. I'm Eric Davidson. I'm the president of the American Geophysical Union. And I think the person I'm supposed to introduce really needs no introduction. I'm sure all of you are very much aware of who Mr. Dan Rather is. And I think I'm going to give you all the time instead of making a lengthy introduction. I already did that once today. And I'll let Dan, Mr. Rather's assistant, introduce himself. He's going to be helping with some of the back and forth with questions.
I'm Elliot Kirshner, and I've worked with Dan for many years, so we're just going to help out. So.
Okay. All right, we'll start with questions. Right, Randy?
Mr. Rather, thank you very much for doing this. Randy Shostak, I'm a reporter with EOS, the news service of the American Geophysical Union. To start with, I wonder, your book talks a lot about patriotism. I wonder if you can tell, what does patriotism mean for scientists at this moment in history in our country? And what does it mean for journalists who are covering the sciences and covering this administration's stances on science?
All right, I'm going to ask one reason my friend and co-author, Elliot Kirshner, is with me. As I explained in the big room, I don't hear as well as I once did. Frequently the volume is okay, but the clarity is not okay. So for my benefit, and maybe those in the back of the room, Elliot's going to try to state the question so I can understand it. I'll do my best to answer it. Thank you for understanding.
I think the question is, you, in the book, talk about patriotism a lot, and what does patriotism mean? How do you define patriotism in terms of for scientists? And also for journalists who are covering science, especially?
Well, first of all, I don't think there's a different patriotism for each one of us or each profession. That patriotism is patriotism. And I will try to answer the question, but I will say one of the reasons I wrote What Unites Us, these reflections on patriotism, is not that I think I have all the answers, but that I think it's important we have a conversation about it, particularly right now. I think it's important we have a conversation about what is patriotism here as we go along in the 21st century. And so I think whether one's a scientist, a journalist, a welder, or a welder's helper, it's important to ask yourself the question, what do I individually think patriotism is? Now, for myself, one, I think, fairly good definition of patriotism is you love the country. You love it in a deep and abiding way, even to the point where literally you're prepared to give your life for your country. But the core of patriotism includes humility, a understanding you love the country's great, but we're not perfect. We're an experimental people constantly searching to try to create a more perfect union. So the reason I think this is important, and we'll get on some other questions, because obviously it's something I feel strongly about. However you define patriotism, it's important to know that it's different from nationalism. These are two different words. They have two different dictionary meanings. They do overlap in some ways. But patriotism, as I say, includes a lot of humility. I recognize that humility is not a word favored by past or present television anchormen, but in this case, it's very important. Nationalism is more in the spirit of conceit and arrogance. Nationalism carries with it the connotation of kind of beating your chest and saying, you know, USA, USA, we're the greatest there ever been, no problems. And the danger that I see, which is particularly, I think, in sharp focus right now, in not recognizing the difference between patriotism and nationalism, that extreme economic nationalism in the 1920s led to the Great Depression. Extreme racial nationalism, called Aryan nationalism at the time, led to Adolf Hitler. And we know through the great arc of history that the way these things start is frequently an authoritarian or an authoritarian leading leader or regime comes to power. And the first thing you know, that authoritarian force is talking about nationalism, not so much about patriotism. And the slope down from nationalism can lead to nativism, which in turn can lead to tribalism. And I think we all understand that if we descend into tribalism, we're not there yet. This is the struggle to hold ourselves together, become something more than just a loose-living tribe. If we ever descend into tribalism, we're not going to have the kind of country we have. So that's the reason I spend some time in the book discussing patriotism and nationalism and the difference between the two. Sorry the answer is long, but two things. One, it's a complicated subject, and two, I really do care about it.
Great, next.
Thank you. I'm Alex Witze, a reporter with Nature. And as science journalists, a lot of times we report on studies that could be misinterpreted. Maybe it's a glacier that's not melting as much as people had thought, or reporting a story that a particular hurricane can't be linked to climate change just yet. As reporters, how should we think about how to report and cover those stories that might get twisted out of context once they become public?
Well, let me say, first of all, that as I think most of you in this room know, that what you're looking at is a reporter who got lucky, very lucky, that I don't consider myself an expert on anything, and probably not, even at this advanced age, when I think seriously about it, not in a position to give much advice that's worth very much. But I do want to try to answer your question. And look, context, particularly historical context and scientific context, and perspective are always important when we're reporting. And no matter what the struggle is, what the difficulties are, to constantly be striving to put your reporting, get to report with some perspective and to put it in context is always important. If I understand your question, how can you deal with such things as, listen, we've had how many, at least 3, maybe 5 major hurricanes in a row, and your question is how do you relate that to climate change?
I think just the clarification is that sometimes some of these stories, the complexity and the nuance don't fit, can be twisted by the forces, because you say, well, oh, we can't say for certain that this is linked to climate change, or this glacier isn't melting as much as...
Well, we have to always guard against false equivalency. That is one thing if, and I'm now not talking about climate change specifically, but it's one thing if 85 scientists say, we're pretty sure this is the case. We're not prepared to say finally definitely this is the case, but 85 scientists say we think this is the case, and 3 scientists say we don't think it's the case, then there's a danger of false equivalency, of giving attention, as much attention to the 3 who disagree as you do to the others. Frankly, I think that's almost as bad as not giving any attention to the minority view. But look, these things, you mentioned the word nuance, that increasingly, particularly in today's post-digital divide internet period, where there's a deadline every nanosecond. It used to be a deadline once a day, then it got to be 2 times a day. Now it's a deadline every nanosecond, plus your average reporter is expected to blog at the same time and handle the rockets from the home office, say, can you match so-and-so's thing? So, I'm not proposing we be easy on ourselves, but I think don't be too hard on ourselves. And the nuance of things, that it can be used against it. And this is part of what I talk about some in the book. The book is not a screed against Donald Trump. In fact, his name is not even mentioned in the book. That wasn't necessarily by design. But some of the things, some of the techniques that are being used, that, for example, if anybody makes a mistake, and it's somebody President Trump, for one reason or another, wants to attack, he's either a press person or a press institution that has revealed something that he doesn't like, or some scientist who has talked up something that he considers to be sort of wrong in climate change. Here's the point, he will seize on the mistake and try to just bludgeon you with the mistake, because it's very clear his whole way of operating, and if this sounds critical, then I would just remind you I'm trying to analyze what has made him successful. He's gotten pretty far with this. His whole attitude is never explain, never apologize, always attack. Attack anybody and anything that can be dangerous to my political agenda or to myself. And that doesn't allow for much nuance. But that doesn't mean in reporting on that we shouldn't always be prepared. There's nothing like as strong as the truth as to offset people who want to use half-truths, mistakes for their own political advantage. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, next.
Mr. Rather, I'm Mark Schlefstein with the Times-Picayune here in town. As a youngster at George Washington University, I had the opportunity of being in the White House press room in 1974, a week before President Nixon resigned, and watched as I saw my first incident of speaking truth to power, and it was you asking Ron Ziegler if he really believed all the crap that he was telling the media that day. I'm interested in whether or not you feel that today's White House press corps is doing a good job of speaking truth to power, or has the Twitter era finally taken away the ability of reporters to aggressively push to get to the truth?
Well, first of all, I appreciate your compliment. I'm not sure I'm deserving of it, but it's been a long time ago, so I appreciate it very much. Secondarily, things change in journalism. What hasn't changed in our society? And being a White House reporter now is, in many ways, much more difficult than it was during my 10 years as chief White House correspondent for CBS News. But I think overall, and in the main, there certainly are people who are White House correspondents today that I think are doing the best they can under the circumstances. That it's always, well, certainly in my lifetime, been some version of you're facing a propaganda machine. The propaganda machine has gotten to the point now where it's more powerful. It's used with more cynicism than ever before. But I would say about the White House reporters today that I see trying to ask tough questions and follow up with tough questions. It reminds me, in old cow towns in West Texas, they used to have signs that said, "Please don't shoot the piano player. He's doing the best he can." And I think that applies to these White House correspondents. Most of them are doing the best they can. Some are better than others than facing with tough questions. But that they're facing such a blizzard of misinformation and frequently downright lies because, and we need to see this clearly, we have many of the most powerful political figures in the country are trying to move us to a post-truth political era in which truth doesn't matter anymore. Facts, hard facts, provable facts don't matter anymore. And they think with the election of President Trump that they got pretty far down the road with that, and with his help that they're continuing to get down the road with that. I'm very hopeful that over the long pull, and maybe the medium to long pull, that no majority of the American people will follow through that. But when you talk about what these White House correspondents are faced with, what they're trying to do, I'm trying to think of a metaphor that would be usable in this room. That, it's sort of facing a manure spreader in a windstorm. And it's pretty hard when you have, as I say, a deadline every nanosecond to try to, be steady, listen to what's said, ask tough questions, and follow up.
Hello, Mr. Rather. Thank you so much for being here. My name's Ellen Prager. I'm a scientist turned storyteller. I write popular science and children's books, and I work with the television networks. My question for you is, how do we get more science in the popular press, in the popular media to reach those masses that don't necessarily read nature or science? How do we get past some of the gatekeepers?
Well, this was the subject of most of my talk today, and it's something that I do have a passion for. I think the answer to your question is become better storytellers and cooperate, learn how to play team with good storytellers. I've said science is a great story. It's the greatest story in mankind. Let's set aside some religious efforts, but it's a great story. But individual scientists, that some are quite good at it, in getting, I want the public to have the kind of imagination and inspiration that science fosters in those who know science well. And I think it can do that, but it all begins, tell me a story. Stories have a beginning, a middle, and an end. They have a narrative through it. Now, individual scientists, sometimes over an adult beverage late at night, are great storytellers, great story spinners. But the answer to your question is that it's an important question, because without engaging the public at large and without successfully communicating to them at least some of the excitement, the joy, and the inspiration and awe of science, then science isn't going to get the financing that it needs going forward for what I would consider the outer reaches of scientific research. We can already see the effects of an era that is trying to be perpetrated in the country of, well, you know what, knowledge for knowledge's sake is really fuzzy brain thinking. Applied science, okay, but just knowledge for knowledge's sake, the funding is going down for that kind of research. The political support is in decline for that. The whole anti-elite movement of anybody who's dedicated to scholarship is somehow suspect. This is not consistent with our history. And I think we all know we're better than this. So that's what makes them think things will be relieved somewhat, but it would certainly help if scientists became either team with good storytellers or become good storytellers themselves, because there's nothing like a good story to get the public interested.
I wonder if you can tell me whether there's a connection between Donald Trump's assault on the press and the administration's stance on climate change and the environment, and why you think that there is this assault on the press, and finally, how you maintain optimism through all of this.
So the question is there a similarity between how Trump attacks the press and the biases of the press and the approach of the administration towards climate science? And then after that, how do you, with all that going on, how do you keep your optimism?
Yeah, and also why does he think there is this assault?
So why is this administration, is there similarities between the attack on science and the press? And why do you think they are attacking the press? And then and science?
Well, we could probably spend the rest of the afternoon talking about this, of which reminds the rest. We'll not spend the rest of the afternoon talking about it, but in no particular order. One, that many of the attacks on the whole business of climate change is very cynical, because President Trump, his campaign to some degree, what he's trying to accomplish in Washington to some other degrees, is financed by very wealthy special interests whose businesses and products, by their calculation, might suffer if climate change became accepted on a more widespread basis than it is now by the public. So You know, look, we can dance around it, but anybody who covers politics knows that in many instances, our public officials, whether you're talking about representatives or senators or presidents, in many important ways, they are bought and paid for and they deliver. So that's one thing that's happened. You say, why does President Trump attack me? The second is what I mentioned before, that in order to wedge the country, you see, he's really preaching the gospel of division. Whereas one reason we did the book was there are a lot of things that unite us, but he's trying to point out to people who don't like it that the culture has changed because the demographics of the country have changed, that he feels that while it's not a majority, that it's part of his hard base. So every time he says, you know, climate change is a bunch of pointy-headed Elliot's a Harvard graduate, but you know what I mean, a bunch of pointy-headed intellectual elite, know-nothing people out of best schools. It resonates with those. The third reason he attacks, not just climate change, but the press, is bolted into two branches. First of all, it's a change the subject technique. Some comedian, I've forgotten his name, had the old skipperoo, you know. If it's negative about President Trump, then attack somebody, attack the press as a diversion from that. And the other is an overall and more insidious effort to consistently, you say, why does he attack the press? Is to intimidate. That a president has tremendous power to affect large corporations, many of whom control much of the national distribution of news. So, on the one hand, he can, by attacking the press, he can change the subject. On the other hand, he can intimidate, if not individual reporters, at least the owners of the companies. Folks, you've been terrific to me, and I appreciate it. If there are any other questions, I'll do my best, but I've got plenty.
Wait, one last thing, just because I think it's something general, the last bit briefly, is like, with all that being said, why are you optimistic?
I'm sorry. Well, I'm optimistic by nature and by experience, and without apology, but primarily on experience. And also, I'm optimistic because while I'm not a history professor, I know some things about the history of the country. And our whole history has been, sometimes we go 2 steps forward and 1 step back, sometimes we're 2 steps back and 1 or 2 steps forward. But there is a fundamental decency and empathetic core to the people of the United States, that when the big chips are on the table, which is to say when you absolutely positively have to have it, then the country responds. We do that time after time, not just in the case of war or being attacked, but natural disasters and other things. So when you say, why am I optimistic? It's just in my nature. Also, my experience is that. And thirdly, I think sometimes about the alternative. If you're not optimistic, then where do you go? But I do think our history justifies being optimism. Look, but that's not a Pollyannish optimism with me. We're in a very perilous time in this country. This is not normal. And it's not good enough to say, oh, well, I'm optimistic and things will get better. I'm optimistic that people will do what they have to do eventually to change it. There is an ebb and flow to American politics. And when it ebbs in one direction, it sometimes flows somewhat back toward the other. But anybody who doesn't like the current leadership, whether it's national or local leadership, the way through that is to the ballot box. The Washington Post recently used a phrase I liked a lot. It said, the ultimate revenge is at the ballot box. So it's, if you don't like what's happening, you got to get active, organize, get yourself and get people to the polls. That's where the change can be effected.
All right, I believe we have time for one last question.
Hi, Mohi Kumar. I'm here with EOS, the news arm of the American Geophysical Union. And I come here as a scientist and a journalist. And I was struck by your speech. You talked about skeptics that might be persuaded with storytelling and the difference between skeptics and cynics. And I can see this as like generationally there's a culture shift with the systematic approach to such storytelling. But what do we do about the cynics who are anti-elite right now? How do we engage with them? Do we wait them out until they have less relevance? All of us here have some relative who is that cynic, or that person we know who is that cynic. What do we do to engage them to get them on board with the science and the importance of it?
The question is about, okay, there's differences between skeptics and cynics, but what do we do about the cynics? Do we just wait them out? Do we try to engage with them?
No. You stand, you fight, you resist, and never succumb yourself to cynicism. That one of the things in the book, what I hope gently try to do, this is point out that words and the difference in words are important. And here's another case, trying to point out that there's a difference between patriotism and nationalism. There's a difference between compassion and empathy. There's a difference between tolerance and inclusion. And there's a difference between skepticism and cynicism. But in direct answer to your question, the best tradition of American journalism, nobody can do it every hour, every day on every story. But, pull no punches, play no favorites. And when it comes to asking tough questions and doing the investigation, never with cynicism, but always with skepticism, and never back down, never back up, never turn around, just keep coming. Because that's our responsibility. That in the end, what are we trying to do? We're trying to get as close to the truth as is humanly possible. That's what we're trying to do. And that requires constant defense against cynicism, personally, and an attitude, as I say, of I'm certainly not going to get down in the dumps about somebody's cynicism, and point out the cynicism that exists, as I've tried to do on at least one occasion here today. Thank you.
Yeah, that's it. Thank you, Mr. Rather. And that's it. I think that concludes our media availability. We'll be beginning at 2:30 p.m.
I'm really pleased to be a guest here of the organization. They've been very, very nice to me.
We've been delighted to have you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.